Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I am coming from a very different sector than all of you, but I feel that I'm going to be telling you things or saying things that I've heard resonate across these 2 days, but from a slightly different angle. And I want to thank you in particular for having the diversity in this room, the diversity of intellects, the diversity of geographic thought, and the diversity of gender as well. So thank you for the effort of doing that. So what I am going to be talking about is from the publisher's perspective. I run the open access version of Science Magazine, as I've been speaking to you about. And what I'm going to talk about today is just some benchmarks in science publishing and the idea of discourse communities. That's what we are forming here. And I'll compare that to discourse communities in biodiversity science, and also how readers, particularly science readers, are changing their behaviors. And we've been talking about that as well. And then I'm going to bring in some information about publishing technologies. This may be new to some of you, but how they relate to data and databases. And then talk about some gaps and opportunities and what we might do together to leverage science into action. But before we begin, I want to hearken back to my intellectual roots, which are rhetoric. So the Aristotelian definition of rhetoric is the art of finding in every situation the available means of persuasion. And that's what we're looking for now. How do we persuade the public and policymakers that we are at a critical moment? And we use for that pathos, the emotion, and there's a lot of emotion. People connect with the beauty of nature. And ethos, the character of the people giving that message. And we have His Holiness, who has brought us here together. But the logos, the facts, we have them here, but how we distribute them and how we convey them is what I want to talk about a bit. So we haven't brought those together effectively yet. And one thing I do want to point out, and sir, you just resonated with this, but the language we use is important, and separating climate change and biodiversity is a problem. And it's not even two sides of the same coin. It is the same coin. We have to find a way to say that, just like saying we cannot do without biodiversity. We are biodiversity. Literally, the microbiota on the floor is in our gut. On the forest floor is in our gut. We are biodiversity, and we have to get that image and that mental model across to other scientists, to policymakers, and others. So the prime ingredient of rhetoric, all of these, is language. Now, another aspect of language is the idea of readability. Used to just be syntactic parsing. If a sentence was easy to parse, it was readable. But that has expanded to be readability being the ability to find, understand, use, and remember information. And I want to underscore that notion of finding information, because if you can't find it, it might as well not be there. So I just want to sort of start that as a groundwork. So now I want to talk about the idea of a discourse community, and John Swales, a well-known linguist, defined this idea, and it's been debated back and forth, but I think the basic characteristics are worth thinking about. So the basic glue of a discourse community is first, that there is a set of agreed upon goals and values. I think we share that here certainly, but think of doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs who can speak to each other. I'd be happy to share these slides with anybody who might want them. So that's one. A discourse community has to start with shared values and goals. Then there are agreed upon channels or mechanisms for information exchange. In addition to that, now starting off, these were informal meetings, letters, perhaps some publications, but things have changed since then. In addition, there are agreed upon styles and grammar, kind of a syntax of the specialty. And then there is an evolving vocabulary that is driven, and this is important, by a core set of experts. And they're the people who are determining the language, the vocabulary, and the style. So with a discourse community, as you learn to negotiate this, you go from being a novice to being an expert, and ideas are brought from the periphery into the center of acceptance. Think about the idea of Helicobacter pylori, a bacteria that causes ulcers, that went bouncing around the scientific community from a rogue idea to now concrete treatment. Or things like the idea of predatory algae, which again went through the literature from peripheral documentation to being on the, in Scientific American as an accepted public fact. So those all went through the sort of normal discourse communities. And we think of those, and we know discourse communities. Doctors, for example, and we go to them and trust them when there is a need. You're willing to interact with that discourse community when you have a need. Or with lawyers, for example. So discourse communities are given great value when you need them. So looking back into the early parts of publishing, you had the early discourse communities. You probably all know this. When the first journals were formed, first there was an intellectual society formed, and after that followed by a channel, a journal, with loose forms of peer review, and then quite a few decades after that, then a solid form of peer review, which is that method of how you refine the ideas and the language that are communicated through the channels. And then in the US, you have something like the American Medical Association, followed by the formation of JAMA, AAAS, and their takeover of Science magazine. So this is just some benchmarks to show the formation of a discourse community, followed by the creation of an agreed upon channel, which then created the language and the veracity of that which was put through the channel. So in terms of solidifying scientific fact, that logos part of it, in the traditional discourse communities in science, let's start, for lack of a better place to start, with the money. So you start with some funding for research, and then you conduct your research, and your thought, your concern at that point is your collaborators and your institutions. And when it's progressed far enough, you write your scholarly article and you submit it for publication, and the discourse community, the people you're concerned about, change. You start to care about the editors. What does an editor want? How do I shape this to get it into a journal and make that editor happy? Then, when it goes out into peer review, your community changes yet again to the reviewers and responding to them and shaping the language. Whoop. And then it gets distributed, put out into a broader community, debated, if you're lucky, People ask new questions, you pose new questions, you think about new research, and you go and put that into a funding document to get new money and keep it going again. So in this sense, valued information is vetted information. And this, it has been around in science since the beginning of the communities and the publication and the creation of channels. And this has been true for decades and centuries. But things are changing. So let's look at a few benchmarks in biodiversity science. All right, so going back, the Royal Society of London was in the 1600s. Just for argument's sake, let's start in 1970 with this term biodiversity. And you've got the US EPA starting Earth Day and the Club of Rome in 1970. And this is a newspaper shot from Earth Day in 1970s with a mass of people in New York City. Norman Myers writes The Sinking Ark, and in 1976, the term biological diversity is coined and brought up back to prominence. In 1980, there's a screenshot with Tom Lovejoy, and just notice that there's a TV camera in this. And 1985, the Society for Conservation Biology is formed, focusing on that term. A few years later, the journal starts. And then in 1988, IPCC, Wilson's Biodiversity is published, and the report comes out a few years later. The convention in the early 1990s, and the IPBES starts in 2012, with the report coming out just this year. So these are just some benchmarks to poise relative to biomedicine and biomedical publishing. So this is the counterpart to the graph that you showed. This is from a publishing tool called Dimensions. Dimensions is a company owned by the group that now calculates impact factor, so they take a lot of metrics. And starting in the early 1800s, I'm sorry, this looks very small here, but this is tracking the keyword terms of biodiversity or biological diversity in published articles. Early 1800s, almost none, a bare smattering annually, and it stays at these very, very low levels until a burp in 1970, Earth Day, Club of Rome. But then it goes down again, so if you can see it, it goes from the basically double digits to triple digits for just 1 year in 1970, and it's still very low until about 1988, when the numbers start going up, and you get more literature, you get the IPCC, and the number of scientific articles using biodiversity or biodiversity sciences or some variation of that start to increase after that regularly until this year, when we're on an annual basis, it is growing rapidly. So now, at the same time, however, that this is going on, that there's an increase in publications about biological diversity, there is a parallel increase in the general number of scientific publications that are being published. So it is a small increase in the context of a lot of other science that people have to sift through. And this is in part because of publishing technologies. Oh, I've got very little time, so I'm going to slam through this. So at the same time, still, smorgasbord of information here. You've got taxonomic databases starting all over the place. And I'm sure most of you recognize these. And changes in publishing technology. So gray literature, there's enough gray literature out there that the term is formally defined. You've got preprint servers starting. You have DOIs being created and used. Very few NGOs put DOIs on their documents so that those documents are not findable by anybody who does not already know they're there. And I would love to talk to anybody who would like to learn more about DOIs, which are easy and cheap and make your information findable. The journal article tag suite, which is the infrastructure of publishing, which makes information findable, is developed. TaxPub, which is a taxonomic database which integrates with JATS and the Center for Open Science. So there's this large set of publishing tools that are now available and perhaps are not being as deeply used by this community as they might be. The gaps and opportunities are in particular with linking our data. So it would be nice to think that scientists and publishers were working well together, but it's really a little bit more like this, with data, the scientists keeping hold of their data, and the open and data sharing, the transparency and reproducibility movement being largely pushed by publishers, because that's the infrastructure that is needed to link data together. It has to be done through publishing technologies. This is a little bit about these publishing technologies, about the data sets, and one of the things that these publishing technologies allow you to do is, in one stop, go from a manuscript to many, many different kinds of reading technologies. Again, these are affordable, and once you're linked in to the collaborators, not too terribly difficult to do. Again, at the same time, we've got alternate modes of peer review and assessment, different kinds of journals, preprint servers starting up and empowering the landscape for readers, but also confusing it. Now, also, new channels coming: Skype, Facebook, Twitter, the iPhone. I'm sorry, I forgot to put YouTube on here, which is 2005, Instagram, and altmetrics, which allow different kinds of reads of the impact that a particular article is having. So there are lots of new drivers now in the discourse of science, and we to engage them to get the message across. So my takeaways are, to leverage science into action, is to first establish a stronger recognition of biodiversity scientists as the experts in planetary health. We need to become identifiable as the doctors of the planet, so that when there's a crisis, we are the ones that people come to. I'm saying the royal we here, sorry. There's put a focus with more urgency on standardizing and depositing biodiversity data in sustainable repositories. All biodiversity data. This is a huge challenge, but it's something that we can and must do. And work on those data standards with publishers so that they don't just sit in repositories, but that they can be used and accessed and verified. We should pay more attention to following and engaging the morphing channels of communication so we can see where the readers are and who's engaging and how to get those messages out through the new technologies, particularly those of the youth, and also ensure that the message of biodiversity and climate change is conveyed through all those channels as urgent, but also as positive and hopeful. So, bingo, I made it right on time. Thank you.
Thank you.